So welcome to this Nano Nagle Place event for Cork Harbour Festival. I'm Danielle O'Donovan, the programme manager here, and I'm delighted to be joined by Kristina, Claire and Gillian. The format for today will be that Kristina will deliver her lecture, A Ship is a Most Unpleasant Thing, Mary Delany and the Irish Sea, and then Kristina, Claire and Gillian will have their own discussion around the lecture. Then we'll talk to Claire and Gillian about how their research relates to the theme of the lecture. And finally, I'll pose questions from the audience to all three panellists, and you can add your questions at any time in the question and answer box. So first, some introductions to our panel. Kristina is in the final year of her PhD in the School of History at University College Cork. She received Irish Research Council funding in 2018 for her PhD research project, Women and Improvement in 18th Century Ireland, the Case of Mary Delany, which examines the ways in which Mary Delany engaged in the culture of improvement during the period of time she spent in Ireland, encompassing areas such as education, sociability, landscape, and female accomplishments. So Claire is the Professor of Modern English at University College Cork, and it's great to welcome Claire here today as the lead investigator on Ports Past and Present projects. That is really hard to say. Funded by the European Regional Development Fund via the Ireland-Wales programme. And Gillian is reader in modern history at Liverpool John Moores University, and her research interests include heritage museums and dark tourism, the subject of her most recent book, The Darkness Echoing, which included observations on Irish maritime heritage. She also researches the history of Irish female religious congregations, particularly the Presentation Sisters, who engaged in their own intrepid maritime adventures. So looking forward to hearing about them. So Kristina, if you'd like to share your screen, we can begin.
Great, I will just start sharing. Great, can you all see that? Yeah, great, see nodding heads. So thank you so much for having me here. I'm always excited to be able to talk a little bit about Mary Delany. And I'm hoping that some of the ideas this lecture will be quite a sort of nice, fun overview. I hope for any of you who actually are eating lunch, you don't find that any discussions about actual seasickness will put you off your food. But hopefully we'll be able to sort of pick up on some of those ideas that come up in the paper in the conversation afterwards. So if you are familiar with Mary Delany, or perhaps you Googled her after looking at the schedule for this week's lunchtime lectures, you will probably know her as the woman who, in her 70s, developed a new form of art, what she termed her paper mosaics, or botanically accurate paper flower collages. Maybe you've been lucky enough to see them. Held in the collection of the British Museum, there's always one or two on display, out of almost 1,000, in their Enlightenment galleries. Or perhaps, like me, you're one of the many people who purchased items from H&M's recent collaboration with the British Museum, which brought Delaney to a whole new audience, using images of Delaney's paper mosaics on a range of homewares. Today, I am the proud owner of a vase, flower pot, mug, and candle with Delaney's paper mosaics on them. I often wonder what she would have thought of that. Now, today, I'm actually going to bring you away from this well-known and well-loved version of Delaney and look at her slightly younger self during the years that she traveled to and then lived in Ireland, and thus spent a great deal of time crossing and recrossing the Irish Sea. So the English-born Mary Delany first travelled to Ireland as a 31-year-old widow in 1731. At this time, she was known as Mary Pendarvis. Now, this first visit to Ireland was ostensibly a trip to help her recover from a broken heart after a certain Lord Baltimore lost interest in her. But she was to enjoy this first visit to Ireland so much that she would extend the trip from an initial 6 months to 18 months. As an elite woman with many connections, she easily fell into the social life of 18th century ascendancy Ireland. She walked in Stephen's Green, the place to see and be seen, and attended balls at Dublin Castle. But she didn't limit herself to Dublin. She travelled across the country, staying in houses belonging to various members of the ascendancy elite, going as far as to the wilds of County Mayo, where she visited Downpatrick Head, viewed Downpatrick Head. It was on this extended stay to Ireland that she was to meet Patrick Delaney, a great friend of Jonathan Swift. Now, she obviously left a big impression, as after the death of his wife, Patrick Delaney wrote and proposed marriage to Mary Pendarvis. She accepted, which meant that she would move to Glasnevin, County Dublin, where Patrick Delaney's house, Delville, was located. Now, if you're familiar with Glasnevin, their house was on the site of the present-day Bon Secours Hospital. It was knocked in about 1950, I believe. Now, she would live there from 1744 until 1767. One of the agreements that they made at the very beginning of their marriage was that they would return to England every few years for an extended visit to Mary Delaney's family. This meant a lot of time on the Irish Sea. So the route that Delaney took on all of her travels between Ireland and England was the Chester to Dublin route, with passengers embarking from Park Gate, a few miles from Chester, and then travelling out through the Dee estuary along the North Wales coast around Anglesey and into the Irish Sea, or vice versa if they're coming from the Dublin direction. In the image on your screen, I think hopefully you'll be able to see a sort of rough dotted line that I've put in along the route. It's very approximate due to my limited sort of photoshopping abilities. I believe they actually would have travelled much closer into the North Welsh coast. Now, Parkgate was the departure point. And Delaney described Parkgate, saying that it consists of about 50 or 60 houses in an irregular line by the waterside. The River Dee runs from Chester, but is not navigable further from this place. A few ships lie before us, and continuously people passing and repassing, which is some amusement. So Delaney preferred to wait for embarkation at Parkgate rather than at Chester, as it was pleasanter to be near the seaside and green fields. And that she described that being in town was being penned up in a hot, dull town, and that being in Chester. So this image is of Parkgate today. As you can see, there is no water anymore. The River Dee, the estuary, has completely silted up, but you can still get a sense of the sort of 18th century seafront, that string of houses that Delaney described along the waterside. Now, it's pretty fortunate that Delaney found that amusing because, if anything characterizes Delaney's trips across the Irish Sea, it's a sense of waiting. Many of her trips were coupled with extended stopovers in Chester or Parkgate, where she remained in a sense of limbo until the arrival of a favourable wind. On her way to Ireland for the first time in 1731, she writes from Chester, "The weather here has hitherto been contrary to us, and we are so cautious that we will not venture till the weather is well settled." Now, this was not uncommon. The prevailing winds make it more common to get stuck on the Welsh side of the Irish Sea. So again, in 1754, she wrote, "The yacht has been kept by contrary winds, which still continue." A sense of certain uncertainty prevailed. As Claire Connolly has discussed, and perhaps we'll talk about a little bit more later, quote, "To consider sea crossings in Irish culture is to encounter both certainty in enduring environmental realities experienced over centuries and unpredictability, as weather events make haphazard work of history." Jonathan Swift's weather-enforced stays at Holyhead have been discussed by Connolly, where Swift spent his time wittily raging at Holyhead through poetry, famously describing it as, quote, "the worst spot in Wales." and pushing the limits of his confinement through the written word. Delaney's reaction to her enforced stays in Chester or Park Gate were equally characteristic. A family story, still related decades after her death, tells of one of these occasions where she ended up at Park Gate for so long that she, quote, exhausted her materials for employment. Now, this would not do for Mary Delany. Described by her husband, Patrick Delaney, as a person who, quote, works even between the coolings of her tea, being idle was never an option. So, when she saw a painter setting up to repaint an inn sign, she promptly paid him his fee, borrowed his brushes and his paints, and painted the sign herself. Here, perhaps, we can see a true insight into the creative and artistic drive that later manifested in Delaney's paper mosaics. So, references to these weather-related delays echo throughout her letters, as does her reliance on creative pursuits to pass the time and divert her mind from the recent bittersweet partings from family and friends. Delaney had a lifelong interest in the concept of improvement, which extended to self-improvement. So as such, these periods of stasis became periods of opportunity. Although sometimes concerned about running out of reading material, Delaney was very capable of finding a means of entertaining herself. While waiting for the weather for her first trip to Ireland, she describes the pattern of her days with her group of traveling companions. Quote, "We amuse ourselves with working, reading, and walking, and in the evening play a pool at picket." Over a decade later, she writes that her husband, Patrick Delaney, quote, "reads to me whilst I work cross-stitch or cut letters and exerts his good-humoured cheerfulness to keep up my spirits. We walk out twice or thrice a day." Clearly, keeping busy in the right sort of way could be both improving and distract from the heartache of recent goodbyes. And again, we can see the importance of her creative activities. So, walking was always a favourite pastime of Delaney's, which she often combined with hunting for natural history specimens. The opportunity to appreciate the natural world during these periods of enforced stillness was a positive that Delaney appreciated. She wrote, "How many natural and exquisite delights daily poured down on us from heaven are daily lost upon us for want of a leisure moment to attend them." On one of her walks around Park Gate, she found sea holly growing on the beach and sent it to her sister. Decades later, in 1781, Delaney was to make sea holly the subject of one of her paper mosaics, which you can see on your screens. Again, an indication of how the paper mosaics were part of a continuum, a manifestation of a lifelong interest in botany and natural history. On another walk, she described finding an interesting looking caterpillar, although she lamented that, quote, "some inhuman foot had crushed it to death." She also found shells, a reflection of her wider interest in shells for both their decorative and scientific properties. Although, as she lamented, there were, quote, "none but ordinary dirty cockles and mussels." So they were neither unique enough for her collections nor pretty enough for their decorative properties. Years later, these sentiments are echoed during a different stay in Park Gate, when Delaney wrote, quote, that she cannot think any place disagreeable with such a constant moving picture of ships, sea plants on the beach, seaweeds, and seashells. Country house tourism, so a very early form of tourism, also helped her pass the time waiting for faithful winds. In 1731, Delaney explored the gardens of Sir Richard Grosvenor's Eaton Hall in Cheshire. They were offered fruit and wine, although the occupant was not at home. This is an activity that was repeated in 1758, when during another extended period of waiting time in Parkgate, Delaney took the opportunity to explore the gardens of Gayton Hall in Wirral. She was more impressed with Eaton Hall in Cheshire and preferred the gardens there. So, like Swift, Delaney also resorted to writing during these periods of waiting, although she focused more on letter writing. These were periods of stasis. Goodbyes had been said, but she had been halted on her travels, uncertain of when she would be able to proceed. It's not surprising that she laments these pauses as a thief of time that could have been spent with loved ones. She wrote, quote, "'Tis cruel, my dearest sister, to have lost so many precious hours, for here we are still, and maybe some days longer. The lost potential of these hours becomes more painful than the actual separation. But even if the wait could be cruel, caution was essential. A safe crossing could not be taken for granted." Earlier in the 17th century, Milton wrote Lycidas on the loss of his friend, Edward King, who perished when the ship he was travelling on from Chester to Dublin was wrecked off the north coast of Wales. In 1758, Delaney wrote of a similar loss, recounting the wreck of a ship travelling from Parkgate to Dublin, a route that she had taken only 3 months previously. She wrote, quote, "Every passenger and the cargo are said to be lost. It is impossible not to be shocked at such a calamity, though a great consolation that none of one's particular acquaintance has suffered." So, whilst this comment does appear rather unfeeling, it also reflects the fact that it really easily could have been one of her close friends on the ship, or indeed herself. It was a regular travel route, and the list that Delaney provides of those who perished on that ship is incredibly varied. It offers a window into the range of people who made that journey across the Irish Sea. It included the 5th Earl of Drogheda and his son, the son of a poet laureate, a linen draper of, quote, "considerable repute," and a milliner who left behind a family of 6 children, and then also 2 wire dancers. She wrote, quote, "These are all I have heard named," and doesn't mention a captain or crew. A safe trip also didn't necessarily mean a pleasant trip. And Delaney's experiences were very, very varied. On one hand, there were all the small, common inconveniences of travel. Much like today, luggage could be lost or broken, and going through customs could be very tedious. Delaney's half surprise that her luggage arrived in one piece is evident when she writes of her good fortune that, quote, "I have been so lucky in my journey home as to not have had anything the least rubbed, broken, or damaged." With other items, she was not quite as fortunate. She learned from experience it was better not to bring her coach and horses over, and wrote, quote, "They are a great expense, and the damage they receive by the voyage and the great trouble attending them at the customs house is so teasing that I should never want to be embarrassed again in a country where those conveniences can be had for money." There was also a great variety in the duration of travel. Delaney mentioned some trips taking 40 hours and others taking just 13. Perhaps those of us who have taken the high-speed ferry that is colloquially known as the Vomit Comet can guess which of these trips was the less pleasant voyage. And even on a single journey, the experience was very changeable. Her most detailed description of one of these trips is largely pleasant until the actual needed wind picks up. Delaney wrote, "On Tuesday, the day was so fine that I sat on deck the whole day and ate a very good dinner and an egg for my supper, and worked and drew 2 or 3 sketches. Nothing could be more pleasant. But we went slowly, not having wind enough. In the evening, the weather grew more favourable for our sailing, but made the ship roll, and we were very ill all night, and the next day till about 5, when they came to the cabin and said we were just entering the Bay of Dublin. Upon which we got up and were soon cured by the good weather and fair prospect of landing soon. Clearly, favourable sailing weather was not quite the same as favourable sketching weather. And it's perhaps unsurprising that after a particularly rough journey where they made the trip from Parkgate to Dublin in just 13 hours with, quote, all on board excessively sick, Delaney commences the next letter to her sister with, quote, I bless God, we are all safe at home. Now, all of the existing letters that we have, where Delaney discusses her sea travel, were written to her younger sister, Anne Dews. Anne was not much of a traveller, even when within England. It was usually very hard for her to entice her from the countryside into the town. Yet Delaney held out hope that Anne would brave the Irish Sea to visit her in Dublin. Alas, that was not to be, and Anne resolutely kept her feet on dry land. But there's an interesting dynamic in Delaney's discussion of sea travel in these letters. Sometimes she glosses over the journey entirely. Others, she emphasizes the overall ease of the journey. For example, writing, quote, with such a passage as we had from Parkgate to Dublin, the voyage is not so formidable an affair as it appears to be. For we dined at Parkgate on Sunday at 1, and the next day at Delville at 5. When she does mention the horrors of seasickness, she typically ends on a reassuring note. This is best seen when Delaney wrote to her sister in April 1753, a few months from before she was to travel to England to visit her. Delaney wrote, don't apprehend anything from the sea. It is a disagreeable element to deal with, but it never hurts me any longer than whilst I'm on board. And though I must confess, and I fear you will find whenever you make me happy by coming here, that a ship is a most unpleasant thing. Yet the happiness it is to convey me to is a full amends for a few hours' distress, and the passage is seldom more than 40 hours, and often not much more than half that time. So turn your thoughts, as I will mine, from the disagreeable part, and let us fix them on the joy of our meeting, which I trust in God will be permitted soon after midsummer. Here she is clearly falling into that role of big sister, reassuring Anne that she didn't need to fear the sea, but also still trying to convince her to make that return visit. Any unpleasantness is something to be quickly forgotten upon arrival when they were together again. The Irish Sea separated them, but it was also what might reunite them. So for Delaney, the Irish Sea was a barrier between her and her family, but also the very thing that facilitated communication and connection. Letters came on the tides. As Claire Connolly has also observed, and I hope that she will discuss a bit more in the conversation, the Irish Sea has a singular and resonant place in the shared British and Irish imagination. And the simple question of its power to both connect and to divide has commanded political and cultural attention for centuries. So Delaney's discussion of the sea to her sister falls into this. She carefully worded all of her letters for that specific audience, so her younger sister. While the sea was something that often divided them, it retained the potential to unite them. So in this way, even the uncertainty around the act of waiting for the wind becomes a positive, an opportunity for Delaney to engage in her favorite improving and creative activities, rather than reflecting on their being at the mercy of nature. The Irish Sea became the link, making Ireland appear more within reach of her sister Anne. In this way, it reflects both Delaney's interest in improvement and her position as a member of the Protestant ascendancy in 18th century Ireland. the island is discussed in terms of potential and accessibility, and thus open to improvement by the Protestant elite. So I hope that some of these ideas we might be able to turn over and discuss a little bit more in the conversation. So I'd like to open up to that if that's okay, Danielle.
That's great. Kristina, thank you so much. That was fascinating. And yes, Claire and Gillian, it would be great to hear what thoughts came to your mind during Kristina's fantastic lecture.
I'd like to ask, thank you so much, Kristina. It was wonderful and great images as well. I'd like to ask about that business of the sea and its connection to the culture of improvement. So in that wonderful letter you showed us, there seems to be a sort of an acknowledgement of the difficulty and the distress of the journey, but also this kind of overriding sense that it's really a matter of nothing and one can cross it very easily. It's a little pond that separates us. And I can see a sort of political and ideological reason for that, to do with making Ireland more available for exploitation and extraction and so on. But also this kind of curiously intimate aspect to it. She wants her sister to visit. And I just wondered, had you thought any more about the connection between those two things, the kind of the big ideological story here and the intimate one and the way they're connected?
Yeah. That's really interesting, and it's I think because with Delaney, it is everything to do with improvement is so intricately connected, and she is interested in improvement in general, improvement as an ideology. She discusses improvement in England, but when we get it towards Ireland, of course, there's this very colonial context. What needs to be improved, who needs to be improved is, of course, the Irish landscape and the Irish people, and the improvers are sort of the Delaneys, the Protestant elite. And really, with Delaney, this sort of current of improvement, I think it's I was going to use the word infects, but infects is the wrong word, because for her it's very positive. So it's sort of, it touches everything that all her relationships. It touches what she chooses to do, the things she's interested in, choosing to fill her time with more sort of improving pastimes, reading improving works. So I think when it comes to personal relationships, and I think I need to tease that out a little bit more too, it's the sort of these big ideas more in a case study on a micro level. So with Delaney, the Irish landscape, I think I'm trying to figure out how to not end up talking too much about this, but oh, sorry, were you going to say?
Oh no, just going to, you keep talking. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I think with the sort of, when we bring it down to the sort of familial level, it is just this echo of what's going on all around. That it is, Ireland. It isn't this distant, scary place that, is impossible to improve, and, you have to cross this rough Irish sea to get to. And then Ireland is actually, it's I suppose tameable. It's actually ripe for improving. It becomes, I think she has some very good quotes about how Ireland could actually end up being far better than England because it's actually better watered. There's more rain. So I think that it is just this sort of reflection of all these big ideas down into the more intimate familial relationship.
I was just thinking as you were talking, there's such an important environmental aspect to it as well. You're drawing it out there really, but the gathering of natural historical knowledge and under the name of curiosities or whatever, it reminded me of Ellen Hutchinson, on the shores of Bantry Bay, gathering all of these important specimens which made their own journeys across the sea, although she never did herself. So there's there's a tendency just to write off improvement in terms of colonialism, and yet there's a sort of an incredible environmental yield as well from some of those writers. So thanks, Kristina.
I thought there was so much there that I could ask about, and points of sort of connection, and I was particularly interested in when you said that being idle was never an option for Mary Delany, which certainly has resonances with the nuns that I work on in the 18th and 19th century, where idleness wasn't even allowed. So it was interesting to see that. And also, when I started to work on maritime things, it was more to do with military and political journeys across, either, to do going both ways. And I thought what you were saying about her journeys and her reflections and what she did while waiting. And I was just wondering, had you any thoughts on whether or not there was something in kind of looking at women and their journeys and how they articulated them and what they wrote about them, that to my mind is extremely different to the type of material I was looking at when you're looking at kind of military and naval things, and what you think that maybe she adds to kind of the discourse on that.
Yes, I suppose with Delaney, and then I feel like she's also a very distinct case study in the way that her interests are so much intricately connected with sort of Enlightenment activities, and a lot of what she would have been interested in is sort of, and how she fills her time is very natural history orientated. But I think, like with that, what you were saying about the nuns, I think like a lot of this is also very sort of is religious. Is, I suppose, the what's still said today is the sort of idle hands make work for the devil. Like it still can sort of it's like needing to use that time well, and needing to spend that time well. And for Delaney, I suppose a lot of that would come down into engaging with sort of these natural history elements and enlightened thought. But in terms of perhaps women seeing things differently, a lot of this would come down into like this, I suppose, the activities and the ways that she spent that time. So perhaps, like, I think there's that element of sociability and connection. So like with the, I think with the sea holly, I love that, and I really want to sort of investigate that try and track a bit more around that in the terms of gift exchange and memory, and that in this period of time when she's in stasis, she should be on her, she should be home. She's stuck, and she could have spent that more time with her sister. So this period is really sort of emotion. She's writing it as a really emotional period, and like she keeps herself busy with natural history, but then that becomes sort of a connector, another further connector with her sister, and that she finds the sea holly, and then her sister's really into botany too, so that becomes a gift and it helps connect them. So I think like a lot of the things that Delaney is doing at that time, and I think a lot of what she's writing about, particularly as the letters that we have are all to her sister, I think it's a very emotive framework, and it's a lot of it is about loss and of like familial relationships and friendships, and how those dynamics change, once they're separated by the sea. And sort of, so I think that's a lot of where her ideas around the sea, I think, tend to go, is to that, which I think is a more sort of female focus for her, because it tends to be the sort of sisterhood and the female friendships that she focuses on.
We might give you a rest now, and led to some interesting women at sea or sea stories.
Yeah, it's a really interesting topic, and one of the things I really take from Kristina's talk is just the difficulty of knowing things. Actually, that's something you encounter a lot. There's a line from the American poet Marianne Moore that I love about the sea, where she says, "It is human nature to stand in the middle of a thing. You can't stand in the middle of this." And it's that kind of curious resistance of the sea to different kinds of knowledge, sort of ramified constantly for us when we go searching for these accounts and don't find them. You know, we want to know, what did people eat on the journey, for example. I was noticing Mary Delany had an egg, and eggs do seem to feature. You sometimes find travellers who say that, especially when transport links speeded up, they complain that the stagecoach would just have them to Holyhead in time to board, and they say, oh, there's no time for food, there's no time for dinner, and then they'd get on the vessel itself and they'd be told it's too late for food to be served now. And Thackeray, for example, describes begging for eggs. But on the port's website, Cirque has just kindly posted it there. There is a great piece by Liz Edwards, who I see is here actually in the audience, about women and the sea crossing between Ireland and Wales. And I suppose if we think about what do we know and what can we know, what kind of perspectives are yielded by the journeys, there's a great website called Curious Travellers, which you have the link there in the chat as well, which goes through a number of Welsh tours. And often when people did tour Wales, they would take in either Holyhead itself as a site or Anglesey as a site, or they would travel on to Ireland. And those tours give us a few kind of glimpses, I suppose. So we see changing infrastructure, you know, the history of technology changing, the routes changing, the whole kind of east-west axis that joined Ireland to Wales was very kind of powerfully carried people back and forth, and all kinds of travellers. We see these kind of shifting environmental and cultural contexts of the kind that Kristina mentioned as well in relation to Mary Delany, and weather, especially coastal weather and its kind of mysteries, you know. You're suddenly seeing a beautiful sight and then black clouds descend and the entire thing is enveloped in mist. And there's a tour of Wales by Frances Crewe, I think, isn't it? Yeah, who talks about the giddy sensations produced on the Welsh coast. And she says there's something about these topsy-turvy countries, by which she means Ireland and Wales, and their weather that kind of undoes a person. And we also get a lot of perspectives, again, if you stretch out your understanding of what the crossing means into questions of cultural perspective, difference, language. Maria Edgeworth is walking down the streets of Bangor saying the only thing she hears is people saying dim Saesneg, no English. You know, can't get a kind of a grasp on the place. Times could shift between stages as well. You know, you could have along before standardization of time on the route that came with the railways. That could also trip you up trying to get to the crossing for the right time. And I suppose just one last thing that is often observed and that we can know about are what were the particular sites on the journey and on the crossing. And a site that became of a special interest during the late 18th century was the home of the ladies of Clongauchlin, which many Irish people, you know, from Edmund Burke on through to all number of different travellers, William Wordsworth, for example, would all stop and sort of pay their respects at. And on the Curious Traveller site, there's a wonderful record from the coded diaries of Anne Lister, who's well known to historians of gender and sexuality because of the way she wrote about female desire. And she records her special interest in stopping to see the ladies of Clongauchlin. So the things we know, the things we can't know, there's the sights we see and can't see, the clouds coming down. That's the interest bit, I think.
Thanks, Claire. Thanks. So we're kind of running on Cork time here. So we'll gallop on. Gillian, would you like to share a story? It could be from a maritime museum or indeed an account of a journey that you might have from your research.
Yeah, I mean, it's just so many sort of interconnections that I've noticed, and on my trips around Ireland, looking at all the different museums, one of the huge absences is that given that we're on an island, there isn't half enough stories about you know, the sea and sea travel. There's quite a lot about various wrecks, but all of those sort of interconnected stories and the significance of the fact that we're an island nation simply isn't told, and really needs to be told. And we're missing so much by not having kind of a dedicated state-funded museum about our maritime heritage, not just about the sea, you know, the big stories, the big sea wrecks. But in sort of what I wanted to just mention was one story, I think, in keeping with what both Claire and Kristina have been talking about, in keeping with looking at women. And this is a story that is to do with Ursuline sisters who lived in the building behind you, Danielle, at least at the building behind you as we see it. And it feeds into, I think, what Claire was sort of saying about what the accounts we get of trips. And it's very short. It's about 3 Ursuline sisters who in March 1812 left that building and travelled to set up a new foundation in New York. And they wrote a very long account in their own annals about what happened. I think really the best thing I could do is give you their a version of their account, because it is a great sort of colour that you get. So they headed off, these 3 Ursuline sisters, with a female companion, because they had to have a female companion, and 2 Dominican priests who were supposed to help protect them on this journey to New York. And they went with the full confidence in the protection of God, who was Lord of the sea and land. Now, it didn't go well from the start, so they leave on the brig Erin from Dublin to head to New York. And they'd not as yet got out of Dublin Bay when the vessel got caught on the Kish, you know, which is a large bank as you leave Dublin Bay. And it threatened destruction to the ship and all on board. It is said that danger at sea never fails to teach the most slothful and tepid to pray for fervour, which I think is probably never a truer word. The nuns, the 3 nuns, got to praying. The 2 priests were entirely useless on this. The reverend gentlemen who accompanied them were mute with dismay until things got so bad that the Reverend Lonergan was roused from his panic because he realised that he had brought hosts or Holy Communion with them. So he got them out, displayed them on the cabin. I don't know whether they had them or not, but this was going to save them. And that is what happened, because the ship rights itself and off they go. But this was not the only occasion on which protection of heaven was visible over the chosen trio. On the eve of Holy Thursday, the cold was so excessive that the captain and the crew, though well accustomed to the vicissitudes of the Atlantic, great description here. They discerned a group of those ice islands which render the navigation of the Atlantic so dangerous at certain seasons of the year, because any vessel which strikes against some is liable to be immediately split asunder. These floating pyramids glittering in the sun were a novel and interesting sight to the 3 travellers. They were filled with admiration and gratitude towards the work of the watchful pilots, as all-seeing eyes had not slumbered while they slept, and his powerful hands had steered their attack safely between these frozen piles whose icy stroke would otherwise have precipitated them into the still colder arms of death. Now, after 20 days, they get to New York and everything is fine. Their mission is not a success, partly because when they arrive, war breaks out, the War of 1812. They end up staying for 3 years, right through the war, and then they decide to come back to Cork because things have not worked out. They decide leaving New York is too hazardous, so they go to Halifax, Nova Scotia. There they try and get on a boat. That boat comes under fire from the fort of Halifax. It just misses one of the nuns by a couple of inches. Then that boat is commandeered for the transport of troops back to Europe, which causes them no end of trouble. They're entirely abandoned now in Nova Scotia. They meet up with some Irish merchants and they hire a ship, which brings them back to Dublin. But that ship on their way back to Dublin gets chased for 2 days by pirates. And the entire trip home took them almost 5 months. So it is this great sort of endeavor that they go on, but they write about it, and you get these sort of descriptions that you don't get in a lot, certainly of the other kind of naval voyages that I looked at and maritime voyages. And I think there's something very visible or visual about these nuns and their entire habits, sort of boarding these and being accompanied by 2 priests who became too mute by fear that they couldn't do anything when the ship kind of almost runs asunder. So I think those are the sort of stories, in conjunction with the stories Claire had and Kristina's stories, Mary Delany, that we should be telling, we need much more of. And I think that they're very evocative, all of them.
They have an intimacy about them that, you know, an account of a battle, or, you know, there's great disasters, you know, it's kind of normal travel, I guess, you know, nearly being shot and being chased by pirates. So being chased by pirates probably was quite normal, actually, on some of those voyages. Certainly a Sisters at Sea exhibition that we need to stage at some point. We're running to the end of our time, but if anybody does have a question, they can type it into the Q&A box. None so far. I think we just had lots of people joining us, and the sharing of your resources, Claire, which sound amazing. I think you could actually lose quite a lot of time on the Curious Travellers website. I don't think we're going to be going to have any more questions. So I guess it's just my job to thank you very much for being with us today, unless you have any burning things you'd like further things you'd like to share.
Just to say thanks, Danielle, and we look forward to Sisters at Sea. Sounds great.
You know, I think when we yes to the Sisters at Sea exhibition, says Dorothy Costman. Hi, Dorothy. Great to see you. You know, the annals do provide actually incredible accounts of things that they're untapped resources in a way so far, but very exciting to have them. So just to say, Kristina, thank you so much. And to Gillian and Claire for being with us today. Thank you to Sasha, who has been, she's the Learning and Outreach Officer with Nano Nagle Place, who's been taking care of everything behind the scenes on Zoom webinar, and to Joya from Cork Harbour Festival for being such a fantastic festival director. For those who are in Cork, please do come and visit over the next few weeks, as we're hosting two beautiful maritime exhibitions. Land Under the Waves is the most recent exhibition in the print gallery by Cork printmakers. And we have an exhibition created by Tools of the Trade in collaboration with St Mary's on the Hill National School in Knocknaheeny. And they've created artworks in response to maritime tools of the trade and the history of Cork Harbour, and they are absolutely amazing. They installed it yesterday and have also made these beautiful ships out of driftwood, which are kind of, we have the doors open and they're kind of sailing in the breeze. So it's actually really worth coming to see us, and for Nano Nagle as well tomorrow. So plug. And finally, just on the subject of habits, one more plug. Gillian is working on an exhibition for us at the moment called Changing Habits, 250 Years of Convent Life. The building behind me is 250 years old this year, and we'll be staging an exhibition where we'll actually have some habits on display which we are remaking, so you can come and feel how that wool kept out the cold around the icebergs. So guys, thank you so much, and I hope that we'll be working together on Sisters at Sea soon.
Thanks everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much.